So trauma and victims of intimate partner violence. So before we kind of get into what to do to help them, it's important to understand some, how to identify maybe who might be a victim, and what are signals that someone might be experiencing trauma. So obviously trauma can be from physical, emotional, sexual, or financial abuse. Of course, newcomers, as you all know in this room, face all the additional barriers. They, fear of losing status is huge. Lack of trust, fear of authorities. Just because here we think it's okay, you go to the police, you ask the helpers, as we're told since we're little kids. In other countries, that's not the case. So people might be fearful to go to the police.
I have a question about financial abuse. I understand physical, emotional, and sexual. What's the financial abuse?
That's a really good question. So financial abuse could be one partner literally holds all the money.
Okay.
And so if you leave me, you're not getting a cent. If you leave me, I'm not paying for a lawyer. If you leave me, you don't get the house, you have to leave. All of that is not true. And a family lawyer who knows way more than I do will be able to explain that to you in more detail. But obviously, just because one partner doesn't have money, the other partner can actually be ordered to pay their legal fees to go through a divorce, separation, child support. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
And then trauma, it can affect literally how people speak, think, how they remember things, especially under stress. And I've seen that firsthand with my clients. And I didn't realize this until I had helped a few people going through trauma, but it's their short-term memory is really, really affected. So I have this one particular client, and once every 2 weeks she calls me with the exact same question. And I don't know if it's just she's so stressed and she just needs that validation for me to say, okay, no, it's gonna take this long, or it's she actually has so much trauma that she just can't retain things in the short term, but it's without fail. And literally, well, how long are you gonna, how much is this gonna, and it breaks my heart, because it's like she's asking it the first time in her mind. She's like, she hasn't asked me this before. Have you guys experienced that? Yeah, it's heartbreaking. The other big one is how they talk to you, because if you suspect someone might be the victim of abuse and you're trying to get them to talk, they could just shut down. They don't want to talk about it. And then just slowly over time, as that relationship develops, they might feel comfortable telling you certain things. Somebody I know was the victim, and it's literally you're driving in the car randomly, and then they drop a bomb, and you're just trying to stay neutral as you're trying to hear this information. It's tough. It's really tough. And then they might not disclose their abuse. They might appear withdrawn, anxious, confused, or defensive. There's only been a couple times where maybe I'm meeting a couple together for a spousal sponsorship, and you just kind of get the spidey senses. Maybe, and sadly, the 2 times it's happened, it was the male partner was just speaking, and she was keeping quiet. And I kept trying to ask her questions because I wanted to hear from her, and she would look at him and he would answer. And I kept saying, well, you don't qualify yet for a common law sponsorship. And he kept saying, well, what exactly? We can make it work. And then one of those, I knew something was up. And it was immediately after the Zoom call ended, 10 minutes later, she calls. I don't want to sponsor him. He's abusing me. I'm terrified. What do I do? And the awful thing then for me, because I want to help her, but as a lawyer then I'm in a conflict, because they came in together. Technically they were both the clients for that consultation, so I can't give her any advice that is in contradiction of him. So in that case, I then said, here's 3 other lawyers' names. You need to talk to someone. Here's the number for our Hestia House in St. John. So it does happen, and you just have to be mindful. And I'm sure all of you have probably experienced something like that, sadly. And it's just, how do you try to flesh out based on the cues you're receiving, whether or not this person might be the victim of abuse. Does anyone want to add anything?
I think that just for our clients, we add on that situation the language barrier, right?
Yeah.
Which makes really worse.
absolutely, yeah. And the other one is like just different cultural communities. So I had a really sad case, and it wasn't in New Brunswick. And where the person lived, there was a large kind of concentration of their cultural community. And her husband tried to kill her, like it was awful. And literally, like her neighbors, people are knocking on the door and threatening her, like you need to literally like tell the police you're not gonna press charges, you need to go back to them, this is your fault. So on top of being alone in another country and dealing with this, her entire world is also telling her that she's wrong and she needs to fix this because this is her fault and she deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And so I think I just talked about this, but like, you know, signs, if they're hesitant to speak freely, especially if their partner's present. Hypervigilance, difficulty remembering details or making decisions, avoid eye contact, apologizing frequently. I've actually seen that firsthand. So literally, like, they've done nothing wrong, we're just having a conversation, I'm sorry, did I interrupt? I'm sorry. And it's just, for whatever reason, that's part of the trauma, that they feel like they constantly have to apologize. Appears overly agreeable, and defers all decisions to someone else. And that's something that you might have encountered, I know I have. My job is not to tell someone what to do. I can present options, I can present the risks and the benefits to each, but I can't say you have to do this. And so in your situation, when you're talking, they might ask you that, well, what do I do? What should I do? And that often, if they can't make decisions, that's a symptom of trauma. And then of course, the big one that I'm sure you see is they're expressing fear about their immigration status. Their children, are they gonna be forced to leave Canada?
Don't rush, just when you're ready. I just want to mention too, in the appendix, I gave you one around the legal resources. I have someone in the office who's doing one around the trauma supports you might want. She's working on it as we speak, so I'll bring you as soon as we can. We have it for St. John, but I want you to have it specifically for Moncton, so just to let you know that will come.
And that's really important as well, because there's also vicarious trauma or secondhand trauma. So just by you hearing these horrific stories, it can really impact you, like you can feel it. So you have important, and I know in one of the appendices you shared with me, talks about self-care, and just as a team talking about it and kind of doing that unloading for yourself. So best practices, if you suspect you're dealing with someone who's been a victim, obviously like privacy is super important, ensuring wherever you're meeting with them, it's in a safe space where they feel secure. Trauma-informed language, and I think in your appendix it talks about the language
section on trauma. Yes.
Yeah. This was an interesting one when I was looking it up. It's like offer choices. You don't want to look like you're the authoritarian figure when you're dealing with a victim. They need to feel empowered. And so even in your communication style, it's offering choices to them to make, validating their feelings. Obviously, one of the biggest fears of a victim of gender-based violence is they're not going to believe me, because often that's what they're told by their abuser. So just affirming what they're saying and that their feelings are valid goes a long way for them. You can't push them to tell you stuff. I've seen that firsthand. Obviously, you can be a safe space and you can tell them that you're here when they're ready to talk about it. But if they're not ready, they're not going to tell you. And just be non-judgmental and supportive.
I was gonna say too, with the hearing piece, we have situations in our agency with Elizabeth Fry, many of our folks have been in the correctional system or at risk of being and very sensitive about their own information, and awfully well-meaning volunteers that want to engage with them, and that's sort of a Canadian culture thing too, I think. So we'll ask the questions, you know, tell me where you grew up, or tell me, you know, where are you living now, and how many in your family, where it can be very intrusive if you're, as you know. And so we really try and encourage, let the information come to you naturally. But I just want to say in our own work, we observe that.
To that
trying to be helpful, trying to connect, because we say relationship is everything. But let them lead the relationship.
It's so true. So one of my best friends, and I met her through volunteer work at the Recovery Center. She's from Russia. And we became really good friends. We've been friends for years. And I invited her over to my house with some of my closest girlfriends. And my girlfriends are so nice and welcoming, and we're all sitting in the living room, and they just start at her, like, oh, how'd you meet your husband? Blah, 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 blah. She looked at me and came like this close to my hand. She goes, why are they intruding so much? I don't want to share. And so that was something, like, my friends just thought they were being really nice and welcoming. She hated it. Like, this was not her thing, and she was actually, like, very uncomfortable in the situation. So I'm sure
We mean well.
we went, yeah, and they did. Yeah, so understanding cultural norms might discourage open discussion about abuse. Cultural communities might actively try to get involved, like I touched on. They might try to convince the victim to stay or to drop charges. Acknowledge power balance, I just touched on that. Reassure the client. They probably need to hear this more than once. What they're telling you is confidential. You're not going to go share it unless you have their permission. And then also know how to do safety check-ins. So you don't know how bad it is if they're not sharing everything. Like, if you're talking to someone and you suspect that this is happening, how do you do a safety check-in and, like, are you safe to go home today? You know, you might assume that something like this is more of an abstract thing, but can they actually go home? And if you don't think so, you know, you can't tell them what to do, but you can say, we can call the police, we can call a shelter right now, we can try to find a place for you to go. And then the big one is avoid giving printed materials if you don't think it's safe. So you don't want to send somebody home with a whole bunch of pamphlets for a transition house if that's going to put them in more danger.
We have a link, I don't know if Magna has it, we have a link on our eFry one that if you click on it, because if you're looking at resources and you want that to be known, if you click on it, it takes you to an Amazon order site.
Yeah.
So it shuts down your screen. Yeah.
And same with IRCC. If you go to that particular web page to look for help, it shows, like, there's instructions like how to get out of it instantly and clear your browser. And then so obviously keep up-to-date information on local shelters, transition houses, legal aid, immigration lawyers, trauma-informed counselors. Sometimes clients will come in and they might not realize, because it might not be something that's typical in their country, or maybe just not socially, like, acceptable. My family's from England, we don't do therapy, right? But it's obviously very helpful. So just having contact information for counselors or social workers that can help them, and understanding that there's nothing wrong with getting help and seeking help. And 24-hour crisis lines. And then offer to call, so if,
I think you can answer that the United Way 211 number.
Yes.
Yes.
No, that's great. Yes.
yeah, absolutely.
Because they can help people navigate the system as well.
And we'll have that updated for Moncton too.
Perfect, yeah. Okay, so since we've already covered that immigration isn't covered under legal aid, and if you encounter someone who is the victim of abuse, there is a special permit. We talked about temporary resident permits, that Band-Aid to fix a problem. And so there's this very particular kind of temporary resident permit. It's processed in a different office altogether for victims of, and they say intimate partner violence, but thank you for putting that out, Michelle. It should be gender-based violence. As opposed to just intimate partner violence, because it encompasses a number of other types of relationships. And so, what is this permit and how is it different? And when you talk about eligibility criteria, we're also going to talk about, like, what does that kind of application look like? And then also, can I apply for permanent residence? So who's eligible? So the person has to be physically in Canada. You can't help someone who's outside of Canada for this kind of permit. So you have to already be here, have to be experiencing some form of abuse. It can be physical, sexual, psychological, financial, or neglect. On IRCC's website, it even lists other examples of types of abuse, and one of them is withholding status documents. So that's a really common one, is like one partner might keep the work permit and the study permit for the kids, and the victim might not even know what their status is in Canada or when it's going to expire, and that's a form of abuse. The other big criteria is that they would be seeking permanent resident status that's contingent upon remaining in a genuine relationship with the abuser. And that relationship is critical for their status in Canada. Because the whole point of this permit is we don't want to force people to stay with an abuser because they're fearful of losing their immigration status in Canada. Victims of the special TRP or temporary resident permit, if it's valid for more than 6 months, they also get an open work permit, they get health coverage, and they get special coverage for trauma counseling. And so the steps in the process, and this is where volunteers can really help. I don't know if anyone's trying to deal with IRCC, like there's no human contact, it's a nightmare. It's very discouraging, except for this. There's actually compassionate humans here. So there is a number. I haven't called it recently because I'm a lawyer and now we're allowed to kind of circumvent these steps, but as a volunteer, you could call this number or you can submit a web form. The policy is a human is supposed to call you back within 2 days. And then they will direct you how to go through the process. They, on their website, and it's a little bit older, but some web pages say that a victim can actually walk into a local IRCC office. I have my doubts. I would love to think that's possible. If any of you have ever had any experience, there's no counter service. It's not like you could walk up. It's all shut down. There's like a little phone there. But supposedly a victim can actually knock on the door and go in. Or you can submit, so this is how I do it. I know where to go and I'm submitting an application directly. I don't have to identify the victims.
So I have a question, like
Yeah.
out of curiosity. So, out of the types of abuse, there's neglect, right? So if someone came and said, like, he or she suffering from neglect and this is kind of abuse and she wants to apply for temporary residency permit, is it the same as other kinds of abuse or are all dealt with the same or?
That's an excellent question. And just because there's this policy in place, it doesn't mean that if you apply, you get it.
Okay.
It's case by case. They're going to review whatever evidence you're providing.
Mhm.
And so neglect is going to be a hard one to prove,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Absolutely. So you have to be really creative in how you're showing neglect.
Okay.
It's with any application, the onus is on the person applying to give the evidence. So they'll say, well, these are some of the examples that we'll look at, but every case is very fact specific. And so looking at evidence that you would gather, so like there's some basic things, obviously their personal information, passports, status documents, if they have them, birth certificates, marriage certificates, because that is important. So say you have a victim with children, the children are also eligible for this permit as well. So we need to show that the kids are actually your kids. So that's why the birth certificates are important. Or a marriage certificate, you gotta establish that familial relationship. Police reports, that's the best evidence if you have it. Not all victims call the police, but if they do, you can get police reports. And I just went down that road for a client, and we asked for urgent processing because the client had lost her status and she couldn't work, and it still took, I wanna say 5 weeks to get it. And that was me calling and emailing, because it's not just I'm calling up the Fredericton Police Station. There's the equivalent of their own internal Right to Information Act request that goes in, and it's got to go through all the channels, and then they've got to pull the file, and they've got to vet it and redact third-party information. So it takes a while, but really good, strong evidence. Because in that case, we could show the police were called like 4 times to the house, and they documented injuries. Medical reports, obviously same thing, like emergency records. If the family doctor's aware of it, you get a letter from the family doctor. photographs of injuries, communications with the abuser, evidence of threats. Shockingly, sometimes they are texting and saying like, you know, you're gonna get deported, things like that, like really good evidence to include. Court records, if the abuser had to go to court for anything, you can get victim impact statements, court appearances, if there's a that should be no contact, not co-contact, no contact order, probation order, convictions. Psychological reports, so if they're suffering from trauma, you know, if they're going to counseling, get a letter from the psychologist or social worker. The past few, because it's hard to get a psychologist in New Brunswick right now, but a few of my clients are meeting with social workers. So we've had letters from social workers confirming their clients. And then affidavit or letters from shelter staff. And so we had one client, and it's a rent subsidy in New Brunswick for victims that are gone through like second stage housing. And so we had a letter from someone at second stage confirming that she was a client and she was getting a rent subsidy because of the abuse. Letters of support, so you know, letters from people like maybe in her world or his world that know about the abuse that the victim has confided in them. They can talk about it. A big one that they typically want to see is an actual statement from the victim. And that can be tricky when we talk about trauma, right? Because you're literally asking the victim to relive their trauma and write about it. And sometimes they will, and sometimes they just can't. So, like, I've approached it as, you know, can they do it? Can I help you? You know, you tell me, and I'm helping, like, write it up, but it's still in their words. But I had one, and she's like, it's just too much. I just can't talk about it. And so she had been seeing a social worker, and we got the social worker to recount with her permission what she had already said. Because every time you talk about the abuse, you're reliving it. And then we need passport photos for them and things. So preparing the application, like these applications they're paper-based. So what that literally means is you're not doing this online. There's a lot of disinformation out there, and sometimes if you go to like a member of parliament for help, they'll say, oh, will you just do a TRP online? You can't. So this particular niche little permit, it goes to an office in Ontario, you're printing the forms, you're completing the forms, and then submitting all the evidence.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we have a copy of this presentation?
Yeah, she's got a printout of it.
Yes, we have the notes, it's on your printer, I handed it to you already.
Yeah,
So you
and
can
I-
make your own notes if you like.
Okay.
And on my last page, I've got the web address for the page that literally has the links to everything.
Okay, great.
So for the victim statement, like ideally, if you can, like what they need to talk about is like the nature, the frequency, the type of abuse they're experiencing, their need for safety, and the big one is, what is the consequence if they have to return home to their home country, if they're not allowed to stay in Canada? So for example, I helped a woman and she was Muslim and she had been in a relationship with a Christian male here. And so obviously that was taboo in her country, and she really felt like if she had told her family what was happening, she would be disowned, but if she went back, like she would literally have a very significant problem, like she wouldn't be accepted in her community and things would be really dire. So in her case, we actually got third-party articles talking about gender-based violence in her country and what happens to victims who come forward, and also what happens if, you know, they're in relationships outside of their faith. And so that really helped. Psychological impact of abuse, like if she can talk about that, like just how stressful every day, or he, I'm sorry, I keep saying she, but I shouldn't, it's he as well, and can be victims as well. Psychological impact of abuse and stress on immigration status, and also what their future goals are. And this is kind of a bit of a gray area, because normally with a TRP, the government, like outside of this particular kind, the government also wants to see evidence that you're self-sustaining in Canada. And so there's a little bit of a push and a pull, because they recognize if you're a victim, you might not be self-sustaining right now, but I think it is helpful to show, like, what am I doing to try to get my life back on track, and what are my goals if I'm allowed to stay here? What are my aspirations?
Suzanne, that's when it's lovely to have the community network networking, so
Yeah.
you could say this agency is supporting me with this, or this
Yeah.
agency is supporting with this, whether it's education or employment or whatever. But
Yeah.
that is helpful too, it just shows.
And that's what we did. We, and one, we got letters from a number of different agencies saying like, she is in this safe space, getting all the support that she needs right now to heal. And if she left, she wouldn't get that.
But in case if she or he didn't improve with his or her status, she has or he has to leave.
If they lose status,
Yeah.
yeah,
She-
eventually they
even
will have
if
to
she
leave.
is or he is a victim.
Yeah, this is not a guarantee, and so not all of these get approved.
Yeah, I know. So what's the,
So then there'd be other things that would trigger, just like any other person in
Okay.
Canada, if they lose their status, you know, is it safe for them to go back home? Like if they start going through removal proceedings, there's that pre-removal risk assessment process, that they could then have kind of that additional attempt to try to say, look, it's just not safe for me to go back to my country. And then the other big piece, again, I think I touched on this, but, you know, newcomers might not be aware of the social support network that's available to them. So it's always important, even if they don't bring it up, and if they're sharing something with you, that you can say, oh, well, there's the United Way number, there's this number, there's a whole system in place that, you know, people can help navigate the different kinds of help people can get here. And then I always include like a submission letter, a cover letter, but I just think it's really helpful. So yes, you're including all this evidence, but I like to tie the evidence together. So I have that kind of cover letter that goes with every application saying, you know, this is what's happening. We're including this letter from this agency. We include the police reports to document it. And it's really trying to personalize. So like I would never use the word the applicant. I'm referring to the victim by his first name. And then so I've included the address. This is the special office. And the reason, like I'm like really stressing that because if you click on TRP for victims of intimate partner violence, there's old web pages that tell you that it should go to this office or that office. And the first one I did, I sent it to the Fredericton office because that's what the web page said. And then the Fredericton office was not replying, and I was emailing them going, well, this is different. You know, this is a flag priority application. Nothing, and they just kept saying, this email address is not intended for communication. And it wasn't until I found the correct address, and that's where it goes in Ontario. And that's all they do. So they do TRPs, and just to touch on, because Michelle and I had this conversation in the break, just as a side issue, there's a special work permit for workers, vulnerable workers, who have been exploited or abused by their employer. So that's not a TRP, that's something totally different. But if you encounter workers that have literally been abused, maybe they're forced to work extra hours or, you know, threat of deportation if they don't do this or that, they can apply for a special open work permit. Okay? And so the processing fees, they're exempt. Under this particular program, there's no processing fees. The validity period, they typically give it for 1 year. I always ask for 2, and you want to kind of get to that 2-year mark just to kind of give them a little bit more time. This is the big one. So because it goes to this special office and because of the unique vulnerable situation that the person's in, it's much quicker than a regular TRP that could take 8 or 9 months. These typically come in within a month. And literally, and it sounds silly, but it's even on IRCC's instruction, when I send an envelope, right on the envelope, I put FV, family violence, and I highlight it and circle it. Just to make sure that someone's gonna go, okay, this is really important, and it goes right at the top of that. Oh, and you can extend them. So I just did an extension so the person got another year out of it. So, you know, the person was making great progress, but definitely not a whole person. So we just said, this is what's happening. This is, you know, what this victim is doing now, and we got another year extension.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it's 1 year and then we can extend it, and then what?
So then you can apply for permanent residence
Okay.
as a victim of intimate partner violence. So if you're not familiar, inside Canada, there's a special application for permanent residence called humanitarian and compassionate. And it goes to an office in Vancouver, and it's basically, you know, if you don't meet a requirement in the act, you could ask for an exemption under special humanitarian or compassionate reasons why you can't apply under a regular permanent resident kind of application. And again, the evidence, it's all up to you to show why your specific situation meets special consideration. And so they looked at this specifically and they said, okay, so if you are the victim of intimate partner violence, we're gonna consider it as a humanitarian and compassionate if you want to apply for permanent resident status. And we're going to even recognize some additional factors for this kind of case versus other types of humanitarian and compassionate. So on regular humanitarian and compassionate, there's like a number of factors that the courts have set out. So things like, you know, what is your degree of establishment in Canada? How long have you been here? How ingrained are you in the community? Do you have community support? What's in the best interest of the child? They always look at that. So what would be the consequences if you have to leave Canada? Are you self-sufficient in Canada? Like there's a number of these things. So in addition to that, they're saying if you're the victim of intimate partner violence, we're going to recognize you might not be fully self-sufficient yet. We might recognize that you're not even working, but we're still willing to look at your application because we understand the situation that you're in. So they'll acknowledge that the victim might not even be able to work because maybe they're responsible for their child and they can't afford to pay for daycare. They understand that they might not be able to work because of trauma or difficulty finding housing. And they acknowledge that the path to healing is not a straight line. So often victims have significant setbacks. It's not like, you know, okay, now I've got my second stage housing, now I get a job, boom, boom, boom. It's not like that. Like they have lots of ups and downs and setbacks. And you have to show like what would be the hardship if you have to go back to your home country.